Well, hello everyone. My name is Sara Pantuliano. I'm the Chief Executive here at ODI, and I'm really pleased to be joined by so many people at this late hour here in London, and more than 200 colleagues are registered to follow online for today's panel discussion, which is the latest in our series with MDB leaders. And I'm really delighted to welcome the president of the Inter-American Development Bank, Development Group, Ilan Goldfajn, who is here in London on his way back to DC. And we're really honored that we have chosen to spend, this hour with us to talk about some of your priorities and, what we are all very interested to discuss more, which is, the reform of the MDBs. Ilan's career is particularly remarkable. I would say is rather unique. You've spanned senior roles in the public and the private sector, but also in academia. You joined the IDB from the IMF, where you were director for the Western Hemisphere. But you've also served as the governor of the Banco do Brasil from 2016 to 2019. So you have dealt with these challenges from a variety of different perspectives, which is why it's really interesting to talk to you tonight. Many of you will know that Ilan started his role not that long ago. It was only mid-December, and usually the first 100 days is what people feel is a really test for leaders to set priorities, to set strategy. It's a really critical time. So tonight's discussion will offer some food for thoughts and ideas, for in these first 100 days. We'll have two key areas of focus for tonight's discussion. The first is really focus on IDB's own priorities, understand, in this context of the so-called polycrisis, with all the challenges that we have globally, but particularly in Latin America, in the Caribbean, in the region of focus, what the priorities are for the bank, how you are addressing that, what you're prioritizing in your operations. But of course, there is a second area of discussion, which it's very important to us at ODI, and is the wider issue of multilateral development bank reform. So this debate has never been as intense as it has been in the past couple of years. There have been some significant developments. We have seen the efforts on the side of some, individual institutions, World Bank evolution roadmap, but also there is a wider, discussion on the system reform, particularly as a result of the Bridge Down initiative that Prime Minister of Barbados, Mia Mottley, is spearheading. And here at ODI, we've been very involved with the recommendations of the expert panel on the reform of the MDB capital adequacy framework, as we will hear later, in the discussion on the panel. So in this wider context, I'm really delighted, Ilan, to be joined by colleagues that can discuss with you both the priorities of the IDBs and this wider system reform. Next to you is Amal-Lee Amin. Amal is the managing director and head of climate change at the British International Investment, but she's also a former colleague at IDB because Amal was the chief of climate change at IDB. To my right, we have Vanessa Rubio-Márquez. Vanessa is the associate dean for extended education at the School of Public Policy at the London School of Economics, but she's also had a very long career in the Mexican public service, including as deputy finance minister, and you have represented Mexico in various international fora. Next to Vanessa, there is Annalisa Prizzon. Annalisa is the principal research fellow at ODI, and she leads our work on policies and finances of the MDBs. And last but not least, our visiting senior fellow, Hans-Peter Lankes. Hans is a member of the expert panel on the review of the MDB capital adequacy framework, but he was also the vice president for economic and private sector development at the International Finance Corporation. So I'll start with the panel, but then we'll open up the discussion to both you in the audience here in London and the online audience. As I said, there are more than 20 people signed up to join us online. Our strapline at ODI is Think Change. So you can ask questions, of course, but I would also like to hear some recommendations or some suggestions for change, for this MDB reform that we really want to see. And obviously for the future directions of the IDB. And if you are on Twitter, please do join the conversation online as well. Amplify it. The hashtag is ReformNDB. But without further ado, let me turn to you, Ilan. So Latin America and the Caribbean face a number of interrelated challenges, like many other parts of the world. But, to name a few: low carbon transition, resilience to climate shocks, income and gender inequality, private sector mobilization, you name it. What are the most critical ones, and how should the IDB respond to them?
Well, first, thank you. Thank you, and thank the panel. I'm honored to be with all of you. Thank you, ODI. We need to think change. And it is a pleasure to be here. This was a very interesting day. Today I started.
A long day.
Yeah, long day, but it was very interesting. We started in the stock exchange, London School. We're together talking, so very, very nice. And I'm very glad to have this panel here to exchange views, not only with you, that I'm glad that everybody's here, but also with our colleagues that are going to send us questions, I hope, from there. We, as you mentioned, it's like the first 100 days. Oh my God, I'm already used 4 weeks. It's
it was Christmas.
Now I'm looking like I'm already there now. I have to have everything ready now. But we use the time to talk to colleagues at the IDB, hear what they have to say. A lot of things have been dealt at the IDB. For example, you mentioned capital adequacy, which we're going to talk later. Has not started the optimization of the balance sheet. This has been a few years, so it's good that I learned that. I've been talking about the priorities, what exactly the bank is doing, but I also taking the time to talk to our stakeholders, very different one, the government, the civil society, others. What are the priorities? What do they want from a development bank? But of course, we need to lead. We need to offer a way and find bridges and find where we can find in this polarized world where you have everybody has certainties, and when they start talking, it's very hard to reach some not consensus but agreements. And I think what we need to do in international organization, and maybe it's not in the reforms, is dialogue. We need to go back to, I will call it moderation. We're going to go back to, well, we have different interests. Sometimes they're not so far away. Why don't we find a way to help people? We have some consensus. For example, everybody wants a stronger IDB. So let's have a strong IDB. Let's have a strong IDB that can improve the lives of millions of people in a region that is very unequal, that has poverty coming back, that we actually have some food insecurity now after the pandemic, the Russia invasion to Ukraine, with the food prices going up, energy prices going up, and transportation makes it more expensive. Everything meant that there is quite a bit of a challenge to the region. So improving the lives of this region is quite relevant, and I don't think people will disagree with that. It's just the way to do it, what exactly you want to do first, how to do it. So I would say that my first reform is collaboration, dialogue in a polarized world, if you want me to. So that's my if you want my 90-day certainty. Now, the region has what I call, beyond the shock of a shock that you mentioned, you call it polycrisis, because we have all this shock, that led some scars. I talk about hunger and food insecurity, and I talk about, if you want education, there are 1 or 2 years, schools were closed. It's going to be very hard to catch up with that. The other scars on poverty that was going down went up. We do have quite a bit of GDP to catch up. Of course, GDP fell and came back. So if you look at mechanically, it looks like we are back to 2019. But of course, if it was not for the fall, the trend will have been much higher now if there was not the pandemic. So a lot of scars. And I want to concentrate now on the triple challenge. And the triple challenge, I think it's more structural. And it has these 3 components. The first component is that there is a clear perception that there is a demand for, I will call it social change, for better public services, for better health, for better education. People are not happy with the inequality in several dimensions, not only income, but gender, diversity. We're not happy to have a lot of poverty. So they are demanding the change. How do we know they're demanding the change? Well, first, just look at governments, democratic elections, the mandates that the new president from different countries, from different regions, they're coming with the mandate, social mandate, public services. So we know that. If you don't want to look at the elections and the mandates, look at the streets. I mean, you don't need to look at the streets a year ago or 2 years ago. You can look at it a week ago. Just look at the region a week ago, 2 weeks ago, 1 month ago. Streets are showing that the patience has somehow diminished. So that means that the first challenge is you need to deliver on that impatience, and I'm not going to call it impatience, that the fair demand for social improvement. But the problem is the second challenge, which is the region still is a region where you don't have enough resources to provide for everything that is demanded. Usually budget constraints means that you have to allocate and there's never enough. But in a region where debt is 64% after reaching 70% on average, which means that if you have a 64% of GDP on average, it means that, and we have countries that have 20%, 30%, which means that you'll have countries that have much higher than the average. And the allocation of the budget, sometimes it is not for the social and these goods. And I'm not going to get it, but you allocate to a lot of items that are clearly not in the social agenda. So resources are scarce, demands are high, so the natural tendency is to say, let's create the resources. Creating the resources is even a more difficult challenge, structural, which means that you need to grow. And the region have not grown productivity growth for some time. I don't know when was the first lost decade, but we were losing the decades over time, and growth is not there. And here I don't want to generalize. There are countries that are growing very fast in the region, but the average growth is you're not generating the resources. So social needs are on the high. You have large debt, scarce resources, and you are not able to generate them. So what is the role the IDB should play? First, when you decide the priorities, somehow you have to think about what is this challenge and what is diagnosis structurally, and where do you want to fit. And second, once the priority, you need to think about how to address given the priority. So let me start with the priorities. So it will not come to your surprise that one of the first priorities, I think we have consensus at the IDB, is social. Poverty, inequality, health services, education. That needs to be there. That's core IDB. Second, we are in a global world where climate change is clearly a public good that you need the contribution of every country, of every region. And the IDB has a lot of members, not only the regionals, all the non-regionals, Europeans, Asian, and they're all concerned about global warming, climate change, Paris targets, mitigation. So that has to be, when we think about a public institution, has to be one of our priorities, with a twist, which is the fact that you need to give quite attention to adaptation, because global warming is not the future for Latin America and the Caribbean. Global warming is in Central America and the Caribbean already. Just look at number of natural events, hurricanes, flooding in this part of Latin America, and you know that the cost of what's happening, it used to happen once every 10 years, and it will have cost of 5% of GDP, 1% of GDP. Now it's happening every 3 years, and sometimes it's 25% of GDP, 50%. The magnitude and the frequency are completely different. And here we are having to deal with the adaptation. So when we say have the priority climate change, I'm not only talking about the Paris target mitigation, but in fact, how are we going to help the Caribbeans, Central America, to overcome a very important challenge they have. Third, we talk about that you need to generate resources, right? So the first was social, but you need to generate resources. How do you generate resources? We need, at the end of the day, productivity growth and investment. Both of them are lacking there. If you look at infrastructure, you're investing 2.8% of GDP. That's around half of other regions. And when you look at infrastructure, the first thing that comes to your mind is, oh, we're going to build a bridge, we're going to build a railway or road. But a good part of the infrastructure is digital. Because the world and the productivity is digitalization. So the digital transformation needs to be part of the business of the bank. And a twist on that is that all this investment that we're looking for, we need to somehow direct to regional projects. Because you can finance, of course, specific project in countries, and the bank will continue to do that. But we have the mandate to think about the region. Countries have the mandate to attend their citizens, first and foremost. Of course, if they do a regional project, they help the citizens too. But you need to explain spillovers and externalities, and doing together helps everybody. The IDB, we think region. I have to think region. It's easier for us to bunch. Those are the priorities. Some of them are not easy. For example, regional projects, you think it should be very easy to do. The multilaterals, and we're not built to do regional stuff. They were built to have a regional organization that deals with each one of them. And I'm not talking about IDBs, IMF, World Bank, they all are structured to do. So some of the things I'm saying, they are easier to say than to do. So let me stop here because I know we have a panel.
Yes,
and I want to hear from them.
And I'm sure they will be talking, about the priorities. But thank you for being, so frank and honest about some of the push as well for change, which we see everywhere. Before we talk with the panel about the priorities, I also wanted to ask you what you see as the role of the IDB in the context of the MDB reform agenda. I mean, what has IDB contributed recently to this agenda?
So let me tell you some elements that I think is fundamental. You need to mobilize private capital. Part of the reform is based on the realization that the public sector by itself, without multiplying, without mobilizing, we can use a lot of words, crowding in, mobilizing, multiplying, it's the same thing. We have public resources. Again, it's if you just make the calculation of how much you need to the mitigation on, it's not enough. And then we have all the other things I've said. We need resources coming from the private sector, and of course the IDB is well positioned for that. We have here the CEO of the IDB Invest. We have the IDB Lab talking to the most venture. So we are, and it's not new. We are there. We are mobilizing private, but we need to do more of that. And there are ways to do it. For example, we need to somehow help the private sector feel that they can enter more easily into the region. And I can think about one thing which is more structural, one thing that's more instruments, financial instruments and innovations and optimization. The most structural is we need to provide the stability, the infrastructure, the rule of law. If you want, my first thing, which is dialogue, democracy. We need to provide an environment where private investment can flourish. And it will look to you that this is an obvious, but it's not. Part of the IDB does is creating institutions, helping to create regulations and all of that. So that's, if you do it correctly, and it's very hard, then you can multiply a lot. But that's structural. Non-structural, there is a way to try to mobilize private capital by the public sector taking part of the risk in a smart way so that the private sector feels that it can enter. A lot of the language that I read in the reforms talking about de-risk, which means that you're going to de-risk. But unless you do the structure, you're not going to de-risk. You're just going to redistribute the risk. And that's fine. But you need to distribute the risk for the public sector in a way that we take the risk, we take the first loss, we take the guarantees, we somehow provide bonds that are contingent to the natural events, where if you have a natural event, you pay less. All of these are part of not really the risking, but distributing the risk in a smart way so that the private sector can come and multiply the impact. So there's a structural way which you reduce risk, and there is a non-structural, which is innovation financial, where you redistribute risk in order to multiply the capital. So those are things that the IDB has been doing it, and I'm quite comfortable because I was not there, so I'm not praising myself. I'm just 4 months ago, 3 months, I didn't even know that I'm going to be here. Because the next president was supposed to take office in several years, so it was not my fault that I was not knowing about it. But so I'm praising what I see, that I'm also saying the challenges and the difficulties, but I'm also praising things that were done. There are innovations that are coming from the IDB. Yes. And some of these innovations have to do with necessities. A lot of the innovations that we praise come from necessity. And one of the necessities come from the fact that I told you that one part of our region is needs adaptation, that's facing natural events, they're asking us for insurance somehow. What am I going to do? I'm facing this. I cannot insure. I go to the market. There's no insurance. Okay, so do X. Save. You tell them, and it's not there. It's not enough. So we haven't figured out how to provide insurance for the new crisis that we're facing, climate crisis. So the innovations come, even if you do a little bit, come from the necessity. And I think the IDB, given that this part of the globe is in our constituency, is natural that the innovations have come here. And I think we're going to continue to lead. I'm going to stop here because
that's great. That's great to sort of start the discussion, because then we can go to Amal-Lee, that was actually part of sort of these innovations and creating part of the innovations.
I was praising her.
I think we got the hint very clearly, and it's actually great to have you, on the panel, Amal-Lee. I mean, it'd be great to hear from you whether you've heard the priorities from Ilan. Do you agree with the priorities, and then particularly, in the context of climate change, you focus a lot of the work at IDB. What does it mean, for operations, and tell us about some of these innovations and what else, the IDB and others can do.
Okay, well, thank you. It's wonderful to be part of this panel and to meet the new president of my old institution. So, thank you. I think having come from IDB, and I left. Timing-wise, I left just literally 4 weeks before the global pandemic really began. So, and obviously, then I think, as the president said, there was already some climate crisis already hitting many countries in the region, Central America, Caribbean in particular. We've seen the pandemic, and now obviously with the war in Ukraine, the global inflation and interest rates rising rapidly, all adding to this polycrisis now. So, when we look at, and we talk a lot about the financing gap in climate, but it's ultimately it's an investment gap for sustainable development, but at the same time, huge potential opportunity. I think when we look at what the private sector is doing now, and for those that were at COP27, I think it was quite remarkable how many CEOs from major investors were there, not because they were asked to come, but they felt they needed to be there. I mean, I've never seen that in that way. And that's increasingly, I think, what we're seeing is a lot of opportunity for attracting and mobilizing and bringing this capital into delivering on sustainable development. And I just, and I think one area that I worked on at IDB with other MDBs as well was this agenda around sustainable infrastructure, with sustainable being very much about the social, economic, financial, and the environmental, bringing these together. And I think this issue of how to ensure that the changes that are going to start to emerge as countries look to respond to the polycrisis, that those are done in a way that can really then unlock and mobilize these the trillions that we often talk about, but certainly scaling up more billions into sustainable infrastructure. And I think looking at what the IDB has done, and the president mentioned dialogue and collaboration. The IDB group has been extremely effective in bringing together ministers of finance in particular, but other ministries, but also helping to bridge and work across the silos in governments, because often governments are not talking across their own governments, maybe talking to their peers. But we know that these challenges requires that really sort of deep collaboration, and really to start to unlock and identify ways of providing more systemic change. We cannot, given the challenges. The climate crisis is real, but also the social crisis that we're seeing in most countries in the world, including here in the UK. The urgency now to really move beyond thinking project by project, to be innovating in a way that can really start to drive change in a much more systemic way that can then really attract capital. And that's why I think the IDB group has already been doing a huge amount in this area. And I know, probably a little bit early to say, and I only know maybe I've heard some interesting ideas that are likely to emerge in as the IDB group looks now, and particularly with the IDB Invest capital increase, to focus more on mobilization, and in a way that is going to, I think, demonstrate a real step change in the role of the MDB or an MDB. I must say, I find, this whole focus on MDB reform is extremely interesting. And something that when I was working within IDB, I felt that there were a lot of really good practice, good collaboration happening, but just not at the scale and not at the pace that was needed. And I think some of what IDB has been doing, IDB Group, is already being picked up. So the Bridgetown agenda, I think, as the president emphasized, is talking about these disaster linked clauses that would enable debt suspension. IDB has been providing contingent finance for many years, which I think actually were critical in the pandemic, I understand, where the IDB was able to provide these very fast dispersing loans. But I think also what I think is extremely important for those that have not worked in an MDB to recognize, it's not just finance and funding that is being bought. In fact, I think it's the expertise, it's the working, partnering with governments, with the private sector to innovate, to help take on, whether it's slightly more risk, to be prepared to do those things that haven't been done before. And I think, again, the IDB, I was there when the IDB worked with Chile on their sovereign issuance, green bond issuance, which I understand now has mobilized $25 billion. And I remember that was a technical assistance where I think it was around $70,000. Now, of course, what kind of leverage or mobilization ratio is that? But that I think is not often well understood, because that was some TA, but also a lot of expertise from within the bank, from working closely with IDB Invest to create a framework that enabled the government to issue a sovereign bond that was extremely well received by the market. There's been, I know, work in Uruguay recently, and I think moving and innovating in the type of using financial instruments in a more innovative way, whether that's policy-based loans that I think the bank has been extremely effective in on helping countries to put in place the types of policies and measures that will deliver on the climate agenda, but also very importantly, and particularly moving forward, this focus on the just transition. So embedding the social dimensions into the economic and other structural measures that can then really unlock private investment, but also looking at performance-based lending, performance-based corporate bonds, I think, is another area which, can all of these, I think the IDB Group has been doing a lot already. And now I think we'll see a lot more as people are talking and focusing on the reform agenda. I think it will be really valuable to understand what exactly is happening and what is working well already in practice. I'd love to say a bit more about the wider MDB reform agenda. I am conscious of time.
Maybe we can
come
back to that in the questions. But thanks for emphasizing how sometimes it's just the courage to do certain things, a little bit of expertise, a little bit of, initial, I don't know what it is, a first loss absorption. It can go a long way to then generate the bigger capital injection that we roll after. Vanessa, let me come to you. You've represented the Mexican government in a number of different international fora. What do you see as the role of the IDB being in the system of the MDBs? You've dealt with many.
Yes, of course. I think when you speak about a system, you have to think about the roles, the differentiation, the value added of the institution. And the IDB is not the World Bank. The IDB is not the IMF. The IDB is not the Ministry of Infrastructure of a given country. It's not the Ministry of Social Development of a given country. But it has a very specific niche and a very specific mandate. it is an umbrella, and it is a facilitator, and it's a catalyst for positive change in the region. The IDB knows the region very well, and then knows the broader region very well. Now, of course, there's regional development banks, but the IDB has the whole view of the whole region in terms of the challenges, the needs, the diversity, the huge complexity of the region, the spaces for cooperation, but also the spaces of tension, which are getting at this point in time even more extended. And this morning we were discussing with Ilan the politics of policies that we should be mindful of, and the fact that polarization and populism are features that are, of course, part of the world, but are features that are very specific in Latin America. And you need to understand, where do they come from? Why are they exacerbated? What are the different conditions around the region in order to better understand them? And where to create synergies, where to create dialogue, when to create cooperation, when to create minimum agreements, because a lot of the governance of the IDB will depend on this. And a lot of the adequate management of expectations around what the IDB can produce will result from this. And of course, the effectiveness of the IDB in general will depend on really understanding and really grasping what is happening in these regards in the region. No? So now also to speak a little about the MDBs reform, and I would say that the MDBs reform has been there for many years. No, it doesn't happen in a vacuum. But again, it is all about context, and the IDB is essential to giving the wider reform of the MDBs the context of Latin America, the voice of Latin America, the special elements of Latin America, of the nuances, of the more accurate analysis of the interactions within Latin America, the priorities, no? And Ilan also mentioned about two sets of priorities. First, social, climate, and investment in infrastructure, but also the resources and the need to grow. If you don't grow, you don't create the elements and the resources in order to address all these challenges. No, and this has been a structural challenge for the region, but also one that has been exacerbated with the current environment. No, so I think that the IDB has a very key role to play in terms of navigating the MDB's reform and ensuring that Latin America and the Caribbean voice is there. There was some comments around the capital adequacy review, no? And I'm putting some other element in the table. How would a green capital increase look like? We have had capital increases in the past, but how would a green capital increase look like? What different features are there? What would be the differentiation in terms of each of the stakeholders participating in this possible capital increase? Of course, the use of guarantees, some more challenging issues like the SDRs and the use of callable capital, perhaps, no? But how would that look in Latin America and the Caribbean? How the countries in the region would take something like this? What would be the thresholds of the different elements of this capital adequacy framework in the context of Latin America? No, so I would say that the IDB has the best pulse of the degree of ambition of the countries in the region, the priorities, how would the stress test work in the region, and I would say another element: reforms are good and reforms are relevant to think of, but sometimes or most of the times are very politically difficult, no? And they're even more politically difficult with these elements that I was talking about, polarization and populism. So I think there's also a parallel view, a parallel perspective that should be more pragmatic, no? So regardless of the fact that we're discussing the larger, more deeper, more structural reform process of the MDBs and the role of the IDB in this, So what are the changes, the more pragmatic changes that we can think of that can, do some tweaking here, some adaptation in the other side that can increase effectiveness and that could serve better the membership of the IDB, no? So I think that's also very relevant to consider both sides. Yes, the structural reform, but more pragmatic changes that can actually give, lower hanging fruit and more immediate results. I mean, for the region, no. And yes, we have this polycrisis, and everywhere you hear it's uncertainty, disruption, volatility, fragmentation, no. But I also think that there are a lot of elements to also have a positive view, to have good expectations as to what can come next in terms of the opportunities for the region, no? So basically, one can think about the effects of technology, no? The reallocation of the global supply chains and the role of Latin American economies in this, no? Things like the new materials that are essential for the energy transition. And here we can think about minerals and rare earths, no? And not only providing them as commodities, but what about very effectively integrating the regions in the supply chain, in the value added of these elements, no? So I would say that challenges are quite enormous, of course, but I am always on the hopeful side, and I think there's a lot of elements that, of course, with the agreement or the basic agreement of the region, but with the very relevant role that the IDB is called to have, and now under the leadership of Ilan, I am sure that we will find spaces in order to create the avenues for the region to have a saying on this reform of the larger multilateral development banks reform, but also in terms of the development agenda and growth and prosperity. So
thanks, Vanessa. I really like the call for pragmatism. So I'm going to go to Hans-Peter, who has spent many months last year trying to, take forward this review of the capital adequacy framework as a member of the expert panel. And you have actually come up with fairly pragmatic recommendations. So, tell us more about what they mean, particularly for the lending potential of MDBs and especially for IDBs. I mean, how can the IDB group take your recommendations forward pragmatically?
Mm-hmm. Good, yeah. There are a lot of expectations that have been built around this capital adequacy work. So let me just spend 30 seconds on the context. Yeah? And the point of departure that we had, in which the G20 sort of gave us in 2021, was we need a huge step up in investment. For all the objectives that we have, it's the SDGs, it's the climate objectives. It's very clear that investment levels have to go up 2, 3, 4% of GDP, depending on the region that you're looking at. Those have to be financed. The MDBs are a very crucial source of finance for stepping up investments in emerging markets and developing countries. There are various ways that you can step up finance. You can use your capital better, you can get more capital, and you can mobilize more capital, and all three will be needed. There's absolutely no question. You put the numbers on this thing. We're not going to get there with any one route. There will have to be more capital. There will have to be more mobilization, and there will have to be better use of the capital. And at the same time, let's not forget, there also have to be these projects. There has to be project pipeline. And if you talk to the project officers at the IDB or at the IFC or wherever, they're going to say, my main problem is that I don't have good bankable projects. So the finance side is important, but we must not forget the side that enables projects, be it the context, be it what we can call the upstream reforms, be it just simply the project development and structuring capacity. Okay, back to what the panel was asked to do. That was the focus on using capital more efficiently. And we felt after a very long time, and as you said, many meetings and reviews, that there was quite a bit of capital in the system that could be used. We looked at 15 MDBs, and the situation differs. But our conclusion was we didn't want to put very precise numbers because we didn't have really the analytics for that. We felt there were hundreds of billions of dollars in the system that could, in additional lending, that were possible with the existing capital while preserving AAA ratings, which was a very important condition. So what were these, and just to set that in context, these 15 MDBs together have development assets of 1.4 trillion. Yeah. So what are the recommendations? There were 3 blocks. The first block of recommendations was about you can take more risk, partly because you have callable capital that you do not take into account in many of the internal risk frameworks don't take the callable capital into account, but the rating agencies do. Partly because everyone is underestimating the power of preferred creditor treatment. We did a very detailed analysis on that. The conclusion is that the rating agencies overestimate expected credit losses by a factor of 12. Mm. And the MDBs themselves do so to varying degrees. Less the private sector oriented ones, who tend to have economic capital models that are fairly close to private practice, more the sovereign MDBs. Okay, so various reasons why we felt there is a scope for more risk-taking, more leverage, basically, in the system. The second block of recommendations was about what we call balance sheet innovations, and there are various types. New sources of capital, hybrid capital, like the African Development Bank is now making real progress on. Others, like Trade and Development Bank of Eastern Africa, has set a precedent some time ago on that. And now the World Bank is beginning to look into this. There's scope to do that, and there are willing partners. There is risk transfer, and risk transfers can be done in various ways. For instance, selling to the reinsurance market. There are precedents in the MDB system, but many, especially the World Bank, don't really make use of that. That if you sell risk, you free up capital, you enable more lending. And the third was through guarantee schemes, and there are also all sorts of precedents for that. Of course, they're more straightforward, but they're very interesting guarantee schemes which can leverage up. So instead of taking a guarantee and doing 100% nominal, value of a guarantee, you can leverage it up, like in the International Financing Facility for Education, which is an interesting model, or MIGA. You can use MIGA to leverage up the power of the guarantee. Okay, so those were the main recommendations. And for the Inter-American Development Bank, we did not look at individual banks. So we did not have the capacity. We didn't really have the mandate to do that. But of course, we know some of the banks. I was personally responsible for the benchmarking exercise, so I did look at the IDB group. The IDB has been among the more progressive and forward-leaning on many of these things. For instance, the IDB is the only MDB that has explicitly taken into consideration in 2015, I think it was, the gap between the standalone rating by the credit rating agencies, Standard & Poor's in particular, and the issuer rating of these bonds. And that gap, the notches that the rating agencies give you for having callable capital, for having shareholder support, that's worth lending capacity. And so IDB is the only one that has done that explicitly, but then it didn't really make use of it. And that's in part because Moody's and Fitch have different models, and somehow you didn't push the boundaries. It's necessary to work with the other MDBs and with the credit rating agencies on pushing those boundaries collectively. We've spent probably 100 hours with the credit rating agencies. There's openness there to look at these conditions, in particular when shareholders combine with the MDBs to have that dialogue. So that's one area. And the other area is this is a region IDB has among the best assets, development assets, the quality of the assets. This is a middle-income country region. And with that asset base, there is innovation that's possible, which wouldn't be possible in some other parts of the world. So IDB can really be a bit of a pioneer in things like securitizing the balance sheet. And IDB Invest is of course a great tool to help the bigger brother to do that with the sovereign portfolio as well. So if you look now at what the African Development Bank has done on securitizing their sovereign portfolio, the room to run sovereign, that's really interesting. It's probably costly, but it won't be as costly the second time it's done. It will begin to create a kind of asset class, and it's less costly in a region like Latin America, where the quality of the asset base is higher. That's an interesting one to look at, and you have the power to innovate, and you have demonstrated it again and again before. There are, of course, many other things that I would love to say, but I'll leave it there.
Brilliant, and it's actually great to hear, some positive indication of, innovation and what can be done. It's not often that we get that sense of optimism in these conversations. I do want to open up to the audience. We are running a little bit late because we started late, but Annalisa, very briefly, let me bring you in, because you ran a survey of nearly 500 government officials last year, asking their views and perspectives on the role and the future of the MDBs. Just a few snippets of what is relevant to IDBs, in the context of this conversation from the survey.
Absolutely. I dare say that I had the highest rate of participation from government officials in Latin America and Caribbean. So I have to start saying by that it was a kind of an overwhelming response at that time. So let me make three quick points. I mean, MDBs remain very relevant institutions, especially as banks, and even in Latin America and the Caribbean region. I remember when I started the project, I spoke with many counterparts, in different finance ministries in the region. And I remember they were challenging the role and the rationale of MDBs. But actually, the results from the survey gave us a very different picture. Actually, at least 80% of government officials were of the opinion that what MDBs offer is actually very or extremely relevant for the socioeconomic development of their own country. And it's not only about financing at better than market terms, but also what Amal-Lee was kind of mentioning, technical assistance, policy advice, research, and convening power. More specifically, in the case of Latin America and the Caribbean, yes, somehow it tallies well with what Amal-Lee was kind of mentioning. The most relevant dimension was around technical assistance and policy advice. And I do remember I was in Santiago when that kind of project was negotiated as well. So I do remember that quite well. And it doesn't surprise me, many countries in the region still have good access to domestic and international capital markets, but still 50% of government officials in the region actually told us that the access to finance from the MDBs is extremely important. So finance does still matter in the region. That was something that we weren't kind of expecting. Second point, we didn't just ask about the relevance of MDBs, but we also asked about the perceived effectiveness from government officials. Again, on the four functions I've just mentioned earlier on. First point, the vast majority of government officials thought that the MDBs actually are extremely effective in what they're doing. And to me, this is, again, a very positive message. The second one, unsurprisingly so, the World Bank, with its global reach, came out as the most effective institution, again, perceived by government officials, with one exception in one region. And it was Latin America and the Caribbean, where the IDB outperformed. And again, it tallies with what Amal-Lee was kind of mentioning, and also Vanessa, it's very close to the kind of the client countries in the region. I think that's a very important point. Let me end very quickly with a less positive note. We talked about dialogue. We talked about coordination. Yes, half of government officials across all countries told us that the MDBs do coordinate very well in the region. Very well in the country. But that kind of percentage went down to 39% in Latin America and the Caribbean. And a point, I think, for further reflection, actually, a quarter of respondents in Latin America and the Caribbean told us that MDBs coordinate very poorly. And I think that's a kind of an area where we might want to kind of elaborate or discuss later on, and I'll stop here.
Thank you so much, Annalisa. I'm just going to allow 10 minutes for the discussion, if you indulge me, because we have such a wealth of, sort of colleague perspectives, both here and online. I already have a few questions. maybe while you warm up here, if you take the floor, say who you are, if you have an affiliation. I'll take one round of questions. We won't have time for two, but I'll take as many as possible if you are brief. And I'll start with ones online since I already have some. Actually, the first one comes from the chair of our board, Suma Chakrabarti, who asks, what can the IDB offer to the MDB system to make it more than the sum of its parts? I'll let you sort of think about it, and all of us, because I'll do just one round of replies. So keep that. Is there anyone in the room? Otherwise, I've got another one online as well. Please, there's a roving mic somewhere. Here in the front.
Right. Now, anyone who gets a roving mic has to channel their inner pop star and hold it like this. Okay?
Please introduce yourself.
Hi, Stephen Paduano, London School of Economics. I'm wondering about your work on the hybrid capital proposal with the AFDB and whether you've been engaged in further MDB rechanneling efforts with SDRs and support of other IMF members and how that's going. Thanks.
Thank you. Gentleman in the back.
Thank you. My name is John Gibb, and I retired from working in development. I just wanted to ask about where you see improving governance. Where does that sit in the IDB's priorities, and more widely in this reform agenda on MDBs? Who's pushing that, and is that a priority too? Thank you.
Thank you. Oh gosh, the two ladies there. Oh, yes. Can I have another pen? Someone, thank you.
Sorry about that.
All right.
Hi, my name is Laura Saogala. I'm with A3G. My question goes to, it's about natural capital. So the IDB has been quite a pioneer in developing financial mechanisms that push forward natural capital. So in this whole strategy to create wealth, what role do you see in that?
Bianca?
Hi, I'm Bianca Getzel. I'm a researcher here at ODI, working actually on our MDB reform agenda. And we've talked about, especially following Annalisa's comment on coordination and dialogue, and Ilan, with your previous role as well in the Banco Central do Brasil, where you regulated public development banks. What do you see their role in the IDB's future and its reform agenda as well, and how they can coordinate better with IDB and IDB can coordinate better with them?
Gentleman here at the front.
I'm allowed to ask a question. So the question is to Hans. You did talk a lot about, James Scriven, CEO of IDB Invest. Hans, you did mention the work and the conversations you had with rating agencies. That is a big constraint for all multilateral institutions, specifically because somehow they regulate us, given our AAA rating. But I've seen on them either not enough information, and maybe the question goes to the initiative on publishing or making public gems as a data point. And second, not understanding actually the preferred credit status that we have that outperforms any other commercial bank. So we're penalized even further than any other institution. So my conversation is, you talked about the openness of rating agencies. Is there something that the group will be continuing doing? This is something that we as multilaterals continue to do, initiatives on shareholders and all.
But let me take one from the online chat, and that's from Fanny Leutier, who is one of our trustees at the board of ODI. She's also senior partner at Southbridge Group and CEO at Southbridge Investments, and she actually was the chair of the expert panel that spent all these hours trying to, come up with some pragmatic solutions. So Rani asks, private sector finance and liquidity in the capital markets are seen as solutions to crowd in more capital to meet development and climate risks, as we have discussed. What innovations would you bring to the MDB system under your leadership of the IDB in this respect? And if there is any final questions, we've got plenty to answer. So one last one here, and then we'll come back to the panel.
So I wonder if you could speak a little bit to your approach to handling some of the challenges that the bank has faced during this roadmap process. We've seen some tensions between climate development, low income, middle income, and thinking about your region. What do you expect to see?
Great.
Jeff Hall from OSF, Open Society Foundation.
Thank you very much. no shortage of interesting questions. Take the ones you like, and then we'll let the rest of the panel answer anything else that remains.
Yeah, and quite enough questions. That's why I got the pen.
That's all right.
So the question about if the sum of the parts, how can the sum of the parts could be, the whole could be more than the sum of the parts. And I think there's quite a bit of coordination to be done. I think we need to realize that there's no competition between multilaterals just because the supply of funds or what we can give is so much lower than the demand, what they need, is that it doesn't really make sense at the end of the day to be competing. Sometimes you see on the field multilaterals competing for a project. Oh, let's get the same project, and I'm going to do it, you're going to do it. I mean, and that's the reality. And I'm thinking about it. Haven't we said that we need billions and trillions? How come we are competing? Maybe that's because of the projects, that we don't have enough projects, good projects. And when a project appears, so we need to supply better projects. Now we don't compete to the only ones that appear. So I cannot logically understand this. And of course, some of the institutions have different roles. So I work at the IMF for 3 years, then now 1 year, 4 years, and now at the IDB. And there are different the different roles. We're talking about liquidity. I think the IMF is closer to liquidity, macro conditions, and things like that. And I don't think you have to substitute that. You will have quite a bit to do. But there are areas where you can collaborate. The IMF just came with the Resilience and Stability Trust, RST, with programs on that. And some of the programs are in Western M. The first one was Barbados and Costa Rica, and I was responsible there for them to be the first ones, and I'm here now collaborating with whoever's going to be there, because the projects, the knowledge, the expertise, I think the development banks have for the climate. So you just need to cooperate. So my answer to the first question is scale. That's why the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. You can get scale, you can get things done. Second, complementarity in some areas. On governance, I think it's quite relevant in the way I understand governance, which is transparency, accountability. I mean, I think part of the private sector have gone through some transformation, that some type of norms are not accepted anymore, and I think that you need to bring to the multilaterals, and I don't think you have to reinvent. I mean, it's there. Transparency, accountability, have merit-based hiring and in general. So I think we have quite a bit of course, we need to understand some peculiarities to be able to deal. So you cannot just transfer whatever is the private sector blindly. But I think 90 or whatever, 95% you can bring to the public institutions. Public development banks, are they important or not? I mean, again, public banks, and we're talking about international public banks, but let's think about national public banks. Again, they can feel spaces, markets that don't exist. And there are no lack of places where the private sector is not entering. There are a lot of places. I mean, take, for example, long-term financing in Latin America and the Caribbean. It's not so easy to get 10 years, 15 years for several projects. Think about small and medium enterprises. They get credit, but very expensive, very scarce. I mean, and when a crisis hits, then I'm thinking about the pandemic here. When a crisis hits, credit disappears, completely dries. So don't tell me that there's no room for complementarity between public. But it's again like they're competing for the only prize. I'm going to compete for the ones I have. So let's try to do things different. Then there were a few questions on liquidity and SDR allocation, and I think it's a good idea. I think we have to push. There are quite a bit of difficulties, sovereign issues of being to agree, and I'm not seeing a very easy consensus arising from that tomorrow you're going to have all these SDR reallocations and those part of the capital. But I do think that that's a direction. So I tend to say to the staff and people at the IDB that we need patience but persistence, and this is an area where we have to have patience, but we have to continue going, because I think it looks to me that that's a direction. And then the question on tensions, where do I see tensions? I see everywhere. I mean, I'm president of a bank where you have regionals, which are Americas, with the non-regionals. They have slightly different perspectives, sometimes not so slightly. We have borrowers, which the IDB is a place where the borrowers have quite a say, have weight, which they don't have in the IMF, which they tend to not have in the World Bank, but IDB they have. So we have the borrowers and the non-borrowers. And you can imagine the borrowers have a different perspective with the non-borrowers. So that tension is there. And now we're talking about the smaller countries, small islands, they have a view. I just talk about the events and the natural. And you can think about the larger countries believe. They don't see the world the same. So there are tensions. So what is our role? Our role is to basically try to find some common ground. We won't find common ground in everything. We may find common ground in some things here, some things there. But it's essential to dialogue. Because if you are going to just try to say, well, have tensions and try to solve all of them at the same time. And so I think our role is, contrary to what we see in the world, which is polarization, try to bring moderation.
Thank you. Hans-Peter, there was a question on the rating agencies very briefly, as we really are running out of time.
Yeah, no, it's a very good one. And it reminds me that I said there are three sets of recommendations, and then I presented two. That's a very classic say. The one that I left out was the one around governance, and that was actually very fundamental to everything else. And it includes transparency. It includes the engagement with the credit rating agencies. It's the one thing you discover after having worked for 30 years in MDBs. I shouldn't have been surprised, but it's incredible lack of transparency, the lack of even working on very fundamental things together across the system. Every MDB has its own headline capital adequacy indicator. You have commercial banks, you have a million commercial banks in the world, and they all have the same Basel standards that they follow, and then they do their own thing, but they have some basic. The MDBs do not have that. And some of them have absolutely idiosyncratic measures, which means that their shareholders don't really know what they're looking at. There's no anchor for their judgment. There is no benchmark for, is 19%, is that now a lot or a little? Was 20%? What does it compare with? And that's a fundamental governance problem. Shareholders are looking at a very fragmented landscape and have to make their own judgment with very little basis, because these shareholders typically don't have, a finance background. And that's a problem. And one problem that this causes is that this reflects is that there's an imbalance in the way the capital is utilized. There's a strong focus on the downside. It's very risk management dominated. Where in a commercial institute, you would have somebody who's interested in profit and would try to sort of, make as efficient a use of this and counterbalance the risk. You don't have that in the MDBs. So in this engagement and there, James, I think it's very important. You have to bring the strategy side in order to ensure that the opportunity cost dimension is present at the table. So the engagement with the credit rating agencies, so the agencies are very interested in that. You have to realize that you see often long lists of people. They actually, in full-time equivalent, have maybe 2, 3, maybe 4 people working on the supranational group, which can be 40, 50 different institutions. There is very little capacity. And so what they do is they import their models from the commercial sector. So how do I look at the risk that, if there is a reinsurance on some part of the portfolio, what risk is left on here? So they go and they look in the commercial sector, and that's very often inappropriate. But they cannot invest the time into going to the details of the particular market, the particular MDB to do this differently. So they are actually very open to receiving that. Preferred creditor treatment is one of those. And we did a study that was done, probably the most detailed study of preferred credit treatment, and I mentioned it. It comes out with that it's much more valuable than the MDBs themselves and the credit rating agency making it. Callable capital is another one. What's the value of callable capital? There's 1.2 trillion of callable capital in the system. Just imagine that all of this 1.2 trillion were treated the same way that the ESM, the European Stability Mechanism, treats its callable capital. They managed, they were in the middle of a crisis bears solutions. They managed to get the legal guarantee behind those. So those are treaty commitments, which they are not for the MDBs. If we had that, and I'm stopping there, if we had that, suddenly we would have a huge amount of additional value in the system. It's unrealistic, but just to give you a sense, for that, the credit rating agencies are seeking the engagement. They want to understand the processes and the commitments that are behind that. So this is valuable, and gosh, so much more. But
we'll have many more events on this topic. Whoever said that development finance is a dry issue, look at the passion, and all of you here this late evening. Amal, any final reflection? Amal-Lee, sorry, any final reflection?
The capital adequacy framework is really, I think there's some fairly fundamental issues that should be addressed to help create better transparency and standardization. And I think then that could actually help move to an even probably slightly more, I don't want to say radical, because that's, use the word radical and AAA in the same sort of sentence, but actually some ability to have better hedging across MDBs. Because I think particularly for IDB, for Latin America, but also for the African region, there's a lot of country concentration, so which the World Bank, the EIB don't have that country concentration. So, but how do you enable much better ability to manage risk globally? If you have this standardization, it should then become more feasible, and potentially you have a global treasury that manages across portfolios, which I think would what you are saying, but goes even to what I would call real reform.
Thanks. Let me just see if Vanessa and Annalisa have any final very quick thoughts.
Just very quickly, perhaps the idea of more sub-regional projects, I think, is a fascinating one. Like the idea of common purchase of medicines and vaccines. No, we did that project in the Pacific Alliance, Mexico, Colombia, Chile, and Peru. Never got there, but I wish we would have had that before COVID. No, something also in relation to, for instance, the common purchase of catastrophe bonds or catastrophe funds. Things like that, I think, are the next crisis is going to be there. So the more we create these sort of sub-regional projects in order to prevent and to better assess a crisis, manage a crisis once it's there, I think it's also a fascinating angle of work.
Thank you very much, Annalisa.
Final word. We talked about MDBs working as a system. I mean, the responsibility is on the MDBs, but also from the shareholders, and there should be kind of greater incentives actually coming directly from them to make that happen.
100%. But thank you so much. There is one final question. I'm not going to take it as a question, but I want to share it anyway because it touches on something that we have sort of hinted to, but not really discussed, and that leave it with you as food for thought. It comes from Mr. Ram Krishan from the Republic of Suriname, who says, Suriname is the victim of dysfunctional sovereign debt restructuring architecture. It is time for disruption of this highly inefficient sovereign debt restructuring process. Can the IDB group create an entity similar to the Paris Club? Food for thought. You don't need to answer that. But thank you very much, Annalisa, Vanessa, and Speaker Amal-Lee, and above all, Ilan. It's been really refreshing to hear your honesty, to hear you talk about how you are envisioning, the IDB progressing around these priorities, but also hearing you say over and over again, collaboration, dialogue, complementarity. These are not words that we hear very often from leaders of institutions similar to the IDB. I couldn't stress more how critical that is, and also the moment, the historical moment we are living with all these different crises that are combined. You did say at one point we need to do things differently. At the beginning of the pandemic, I wrote a blog that was actually inspired by the protests in Chile, the title of which was "We Can't Go Back to Normal because Normal was the problem." They actually talked about those social tensions, that real need for change that is so imperative. And so this is with the hope that the next many hundreds of days that you'll have at the IDB will bring these change and reforms that we all so desperately need, and the pragmatic solutions that people are hoping for. Thank you. Everyone who is here, you get rewarded with a glass of wine for sort of staying so late. I'm sorry for those online, you can't join us for wine, but if you want to listen again to the discussion, the recording of the conversation will be on the ODI website in the next couple of days. Please join me in thanking the panel.